Welcome back to the Let's Talk Universal podcast, where we interview top experts and consultants on all things DEI, people, and culture. And today we'll be speaking about LGBTQ plus inclusion, a topic that we haven't yet explored on the channel. So helping us to navigate this topic is Katya Veleva, inclusion consultant, international public speaker, and coach. Welcome, Katya. You're joining us from a cafe today.
Thank you so much, Erica. Yes, I am actually in my favorite cafe by the river to work at.
Awesome stuff. Well, I appreciate you taking the time to chat with us. And as I said, LGBTQ plus inclusion is something that we know about, and we've not yet kind of got into the details of it on the podcast. So I'm really hoping that you can educate me today, but we can also have a really insightful discussion around it. But first of all, I wondered if you could tell me a little bit about yourself and what led you to the work that you do today.
Of course. So my career trajectory is actually could seem unclear, but it was very seamless to me. I've always wanted to create space for people, and it started in creating literal space for people. I have background in architecture, and I used to work a lot in healthcare planning. Ever since I was very young, I was quite fascinated by the fact that we can make the space that we exist in. How powerful is that? How brilliant? And I kind of, my career organically developed into digital adoption for construction, to kind of optimize the process and make them more effective, as the industry could be very, it's one of the biggest polluters, it's one of the biggest CO2 emitters in the world, and if you can make it more effective, more digitalized, that could really change. So I was working a lot in that, but I came from very technical understanding of that, technical understanding of space and making it good. But it ended up just being working with people, because technology is what it is. It's neither good nor bad. It's what we make of it, but it's about getting people on board with it. And I really enjoyed working with people. I found myself actually being really good at it. And that, alongside a lot of diversity and inclusion initiatives in construction, because I'm sure you can imagine there weren't many people that looked like me doing that kind of work. So I was involved in those things, but combining that little bit of experience that I had with really seeing that I can actually change minds and hearts often, that kind of drove me into working in inclusion and the queer side of it. And I use the word queer because I feel very empowered by it, and it's a word that we reclaim. But I think it's important to know that for some people, it's still a painful term. But my focus on queer stuff, your day job versus your gay job, kind of comes from a personal place, obviously, because I'm a non-binary person. I have an intersex variation, so it's been a very personal experience for me, and a long journey, because I grew up in Eastern Europe, which is not at all in the same maturity level in terms of inclusion and really just acceptance. We're not even talking about inclusion, as a lot of the Western world is. So I had to walk a long road to where I am at now, and I feel like it's really important to share that.
Absolutely, and thank you for sharing that. I am interested as well in kind of this experience that you've had working with space, and actually. I don't know about you, but I see kind of the work environment and also technology, as you mentioned, as great facilitators of, supporting and engaging people.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't not agree. Technology can be very, very enabling in a lot of ways, but I think if we're not mindful with it, can be also a barrier. So it is something we need to operate with care and attention. But the work environment, especially global kind of international corporate workplaces that um, have themselves spread around the world can really have an effect on evolving cultures. And especially in the last, let's say, like 5-6 years, we've seen in the social space so much negative attention towards queer people specifically, but overall kind of very radical pushback on kind of overall inclusion and diversity efforts. When the social space becomes so hostile, the work environment can be a safe haven. And I think you're very right. It could be a really helpful and safe space for people to come back to. But when you talk about physical space, that's again, as I said, it's just so fascinating that we are creating the space that we exist in. So with that intention, we can really make it a space that incites betterment in us. I know this sounds very idealistic, but it is the reality, and on a more theoretical level, we think about it this way, right? We think about what journeys people are taking throughout their days. We're thinking about how that affects their well-being, their ways of working. I would, for anyone that's interested, I always encourage to look into an architect called So Fujimoto, a Japanese architect who treats has some theories around postmodern design. Right, with modern design, we focus on singular functions of spaces. So it's very prescriptive, right? Something is a table. It has a top and legs, and that's it. Right, everything is very finite and specific. But he kind of goes on and theorizes that if we create slightly less prescriptive spaces, we can then get people to imagine what they can do with them and interpret them in their own different ways. And that could be very be great for their own development. He has a children's mental health hospital that he's designed that has been healing. The space has been literally healing for the children because they find these nooks and crannies that they can kind of inhabit and find safety and ownership in them. So yeah, absolutely. I think you're right that space
Yeah,
can
I find
be
that topic
again.
so fascinating because it's this concept that, if you are gonna, I suppose, force workers to come back to work after, your remote working and the pandemic, then actually you do need to be thinking about the ways that also the environment supports and heals, or, encourages this feeling of safety at work, as you say. But I just want to go back before we kind of go down a rabbit hole and end up talking about workspace the entire
It will be
time.
so
Just
easy.
it can be so easy. I just wondered if we could kind of go back to the landscape of LGBTQ plus inclusion in the workplace. What are you seeing happen at the moment?
Well, unfortunately, as I said, globally we're seeing huge pushback on queer rights, and it's been extremely discouraging. As I talk about it, I get goosebumps. They say first they come for the trans kids, and with the risk of sounding like every comment section on the internet, we got to mention the Nazis. One of the first acts of kind of intellectual violence and kind of stopping of progress was the burning of Dr. Hirschfield's Institute for Gender Studies in the 30s. So we had quite a lot of development around gender transition, understanding gender diversity, sex characteristics diversity way back in the 30s, and people were very comfortable with that, but it was very clearly and loudly shut down. And we know that these processes have a very clear domino effect. And we've seen what's happening in the US, right? First, trans rights are being attacked, and reproductive rights immediately follow so quickly because these things are connected. Ultimately, behind that is a desire to reinforce the gender binary, reinforce specific roles that people must follow based on how they're born, which ultimately goes against so much of what we know to be true and helpful for human beings to develop and give out the best that they can into the world. So currently the focus seems to be on gender identity, trans people, non-binary people. But I think we really can't afford to think that that's something isolated. As soon as we drop our guard down, this is going to transfer immediately to gay people, lesbians. We know there's huge levels of birasia, erasing of bisexual people, and they're the largest proportion of the alphabet mafia, as they like to call it. So there's been a lot of that going on, and it's quite sad to see it happening. There are places here and there where we see some positive movements. Very recently in Germany, they voted on a bill for self-determination, so it makes it much easier for people to declare their gender despite what they've been assigned at birth. So that's great. But we've really seen some awful things happening in the US, and unfortunately, what happens in the US trickles down the rest of the world so easily and so quickly. So this has been the biggest focus recently.
Yeah, and as you say that, I just kind of came across a report this morning about Florida banning a lot of kind of DEI programs and the effect that's having on the LGBTQ plus community there. And that, along with any other kind of governmental policy or decision, then has an impact on the community and therefore also the workplace. And as you say, these kinds of changes are discouraging and a step backwards almost. So what is it that you think organizations need to know about perhaps the community that they don't already know?
So just before we move on to that, I think it's worth saying that yes, they have impact on the rest of the community, but they will have further impact on people who don't perceive themselves as part of the community. I think that's very important to note. Is it helpful to clarify what cisgender means? Because I'm not sure.
Perhaps. I mean, let's just define that for everyone, just so that we're not confusing anybody. Yeah.
So the term transgender person means someone who doesn't identify with the gender they've been assigned at birth. So someone who was born a certain way, the doctor looked at them and they're like, that's a boy. And then they look at the mirror today and they say, I'm a boy. That's a cisgendered person. That's the other way around. Right? So it's in theory the opposite. So I think and especially this is very sad to look at when we hear gender critical views being pushed, especially from cisgendered women. We see that with the pushback on trans rights, cis women will suffer almost immediately, because the definition of what a woman means is starting to come under scrutiny. So I'm not sure if that was in Florida or in Tennessee, but in one of the southern states, almost immediately after the first big push on trans rights in schools, cisgendered girls, so girls who have been born assigned female at birth, in sports, in schools, were harassed because someone decided they were too good at a certain sport, so they had to prove their girlhood, which is extremely humiliating. And especially with young kids, this can be very scarring. Also, like, inspecting kids' genitalia to play sports is just not something I ever want to happen to anyone, because it's awful. And similarly, again, with the big bathroom issue, it's aimed towards trans people, but I know so many cis women who may just not present as femininely. They may wear their hair short and don't wear makeup, and they face harassment in public bathrooms because they're not quote unquote woman enough. So I think it's very important to know that queer rights are not just for queer people, and the violation of them, the pushback against them, will immediately start affecting others as well. And we can't close our eyes to that.
Yeah, no, and I think that really does answer my question, really, is what do organizations need to know? And that point is that this impacts everybody. It isn't just this community of people that are impacted. It's also the wider kind of population. So I wondered if you could now within the LGBTQ plus community, it's a diverse community, isn't it? Every person, every individual has their own challenges or kind of barriers that they need to overcome. But for the benefit of people who aren't aware of what types of barriers exist to LGBTQ plus individuals in the workplace, what kind of things are we talking about here?
I think it's very relevant to talk about money right now because we're all facing a cost of living crisis, and it's really tough. And one of the most easiest thing to point out is it's expensive to be queer, unfortunately, in a lot of ways that you don't necessarily immediately consider. So thinking about my personal experience, I can start this with a few personal stories, right? I lived in London for several years before I came out. I had to be in this environment to be able to come out. But I'm actually facing being priced out of London any minute now because it's becoming unsustainable. Because of course, now opportunities kind of diminishing around the D&I work as well. But when we talk about where we can go, where we can thrive, these are usually spaces that are not as easily financially accessible. Again, I've had this experience with a colleague once. We were discussing potential holiday destinations, and I was talking about trying to figure out a place me and my partner at the time could go. And my colleague goes, "Oh yeah, you should go to Morocco. It's really cheap there. It'd be really great." And I was like, we are two kind of femme presenting, very obviously queer people. We're not. That's not gonna work. And she was white, and I'm also ethnically ambiguously presenting. And I think white people don't always face the same consequences in certain places around the world where queerness is persecuted. But I can be perceived as one of the people in that environment, and I'm not gonna that's not gonna be fun. It's not it's really not great. And then you have very limited amount of places that you can go, and they're usually the more expensive ones. Similarly, if you're thinking about starting a family, just last week I was at a panel talk where Laura Rose Thorgood spoke. She is a founder of Queer Mummies, an organization for queer parents. She shared that her and her wife are blessed to have 4 children at the moment. They have had to invest £60,000 into becoming parents. That's 6 with 4 zeros at the end. How is that fair? Right? Some countries, for example, in Belgium, I have friends who are queer parents there. They get 6 rounds of IVF on the house. Right, so it's possible to get that support, but here in the UK, doesn't currently exist. And when you think about it a little bit more detail as well, queer people are likely to want to become parents a little bit later in life because it takes time to come out, this, that, and the other. So it may be harder as well. So there's a huge kind of piles and piles of these kind of barriers to just existing in life. And then we start talking about healthcare as well as a whole. For trans and gender non-conforming people, the standard routes that exist in the publicly accessible healthcare are just not good enough. We know as well how long the waiting lists for gender care are at the moment. There's been huge attacks on that as well. We've lost so much of what we can get. If you go to get that privately, very, very expensive. Often routes don't exist, especially for certain like maybe less intense intersex variation. And I know from my experience that there aren't routes. If I don't want to get pregnant, I can't get pretty much any support for some of my conditions. So again, you have to go privately, which is extremely expensive. And this all is happening before you even cross the threshold of the workplace, right? So we need to consider that we are not isolated human beings that exist in front of a laptop, right? We are holistic people who have a whole morning before you start work that influences how you're getting in there. And then when we get to the workplace, it unfolds there as well. So from the UK Gov public opinion polls, we know that in the last couple of years, we've had a huge drop in kind of tolerance and acceptance for queer people, specifically trans people, something around 20% drop, which is terrifying. So we've seen that media's influence that. And when you go into your workplace, your livelihood depends on that. So you want to do well, you want to be okay. So immediately think, if I have a high likelihood for people to judge me for who I am, so that I can lose my income for that life that turns out to be more expensive, I'm going to hide things. I'm not going to risk that. So this is a phenomenon we call covering, and there are Deloitte studies on that, and they found, I'm going to give you the right number, I have it over here. So 83% of LGBT plus people cover in the workplace. That's the highest percentage across all groups. The next one is Black people, and I think it's down to 70 something percent. So it's a significant difference. And that's a lot of energy to put into just being able to start doing your work. Colloquially, from my practice, I've heard stories of people keeping a spreadsheet with all of their colleagues and what they've told them about their personal life and what lies they've had to tell to, feel safe. That's a full-on admin task, right? These people have a full-time job. Before you even start that, you have to go through this whole process of conducting yourself in a way that feels safe, and that's exhausting. So barrier after barrier.
No. Yeah, that's definitely coming across, and it's those points of sort of a lack of feeling safe, a lack of support, and that kind of has a huge impact on the overall, I'd say, well-being and of that individual, but also of what an organization can almost get out of that individual is they're not being allowed to give their full potential because they're too busy kind of managing their life and their own kind of personal things that they're going through. I just, with that in mind, why is it that organizations should be doing something about this? It sounds a bit clinical to say the business case for LGBTQ plus inclusion, but what are your thoughts around that?
Thank you for acknowledging that it does sound clinical. And I think it's important to know that there are a lot of people who feel like we should be above this. We shouldn't have to make the business case. And I think that's valid in a lot of ways, that it's simply the right thing to do, right? This should be enough to say. But also, this is the world that we live in. And I wish I'd remembered who said that, but it's not my own expression. But someone said, it's more important to get progress is more important than perfect, right? So I personally think it's if you can make a difference, if you can make change, if that requires a business case, that's fine. And it is there. The truth is, it's 100% there for any business that is a B2C business that focuses on customers. We know the numbers. We know that there's a significant portion of people who identify with the community, and these are only the people who feel safe declaring that, right? So you can always assume there's more. Again, I think I have a good number for you. The purchasing power of the LGBTQI plus community across the world is something equivalent to the purchasing power of China. It's 3.2 trillion US dollars across the world. So if you're selling to people and if you want a piece of that pie, you need to be able to address those people. To be able to address the LGBTQI plus community, you need to listen to them. You need to have them in your business. They need to be able to be themselves in your business so that influences whatever you're doing and it is relevant to the community. It's the business case is 100% there. There's also so much research around the benefits of diverse workplaces. I would point out to Dr. Catherine Phillips from the Columbia Business School. She's done some really excellent experiments around homogeneous and diverse groups. And across the boards, diverse groups deliver better and more accurate solutions to problems immediately. However, diverse groups are usually less confident and feel more stress around doing that. And this is where we come back to the fact that diversity, the benefits of diversities are not given. We don't naturally feel comfortable in diverse environments. And this is a very deeply ingrained way of thinking back from our tribal savannah living where anything different was dangerous. There's this metaphor, if we think about human development in the time frame of a year, in the 1st of January was when the first bipedal humanoids like stood up and started walking, and then New Year's is now. We like we went into agricultural societies in November, on the 19th of November. So the majority of that year is us living in ways where our survival, our literal survival, depended on being around familiar, safe things. So these neural pathways are so deeply ingrained in our minds that we can't just naturally work well together with difference. It's not there. So as an organization, you need to strategically approach that and create intentional environment in which difference is accepted and where people train themselves to let go of that initial what's the word am I looking for? Defensive reaction, to then be able to benefit from that diversity. But again, business case, so much evidence for diverse organizations scoring in the top quartile of their industries, people being more productive, just doing better this way. So the business case has always been there, and we can continue to talk about it as much as we need to if that's going to drive some progress, I think.
Yeah, I think the challenge that we're seeing generally across DEI programs is that there's a lot of burnout on the side of DEI leaders, but also of organizations. You know, they aren't seeing the results that they're wanting to get, despite the proof of, you know, diverse teams being more productive and innovative and all of those great statistics. So what do you think is holding progress back?
I don't know if they're not seeing the results. It would be hard to see the results if you're not measuring things properly as well. And that's been a huge challenge. As an EDI practitioner, this is the fight I have with every client. Every single time when they invite me to help with an intervention, I come up with a strategic plan that starts with insight gathering, measuring the situation as it is, the intervention, and then measuring after to understand what's the point of what we're doing. And the first thing they do is cut away the beginning and the end and go in just for the action in the middle. So it's very hard to see the results if you're not even trying to look for them. That's been a significant problem. I think you'll find that the organizations that do collect data and do track usually see the results. But I think one of the biggest barriers is the delusion that we live in, that we actually make decisions based on logic and evidence. All the research and all the evidence tells us that we don't. Ultimately, the evidence is there that this is the right thing. The methods of measuring are there, but culture, beliefs, public agenda, societal views are so powerful. And I think if we at least admit that we make, and a lot of people with a lot of power make decisions based on quote unquote gut feelings and emotion, we can at least start addressing that. And this has been a big challenge, I think, because I love data. I used to work kind of in information management in my digitalization kind of part of my career. I love that, and I can give you all of the data you want all day long. But ultimately, people don't make these decisions based on that, and I think the rejection of that fact is probably one of the hardest barriers. Usually, when we work, we try and provide a balance to you, and you kind of bring in personal stories and bring in the data, and hopefully you get people on board. But ultimately, most of the bigger decision makers are always like, no, we need evidence, we need data, we're going to make. Do you really make those decisions like that? There's no actually evidence that we make decisions this way. And I think if we admit that, we can move forward better.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I completely get that. I'd like to kind of phrase this question in a slightly backwards way, actually, because I think there's a reality that organizations will continue without doing anything. But what's the downside of not doing anything if they don't make any changes?
Well, we see very clearly younger people who are coming into the workplace demand difference. They're not only after whatever the salary is, they need to know what the culture in the workplace is. Um, we spend the majority of our time working. We can discuss whether that's a good thing or not in a different episode. I'd be very keen to do that because that's a bigger thing.
Yeah.
But that's the fact. And if that doesn't feel good, if that doesn't feel comfortable, if you constantly need to attack yourself while trying to work, you're not going to have a good time. And young people are realizing that more and more and more, and there's that demand. So the talent is not going to choose you if you're not making an effort to have an inclusive workplace. At the moment, again, in the crisis that we're in, I think a lot of organizations feel like they have the upper hand and people will just take the jobs because they have to take the jobs. And that is part of the reality, not gonna lie. But how are people gonna take those jobs as well? We mentioned before around covering, people can be in a position, but how much are they really gonna be bringing into that role? And, you know, there's no judgment here if you choose to just work for the paycheck. And I think a lot of people do, right, choose life over work in a lot of ways. That's absolutely valid. But ultimately, as an organization, is that what you want? Is that what you want? Someone who is just ticking a box as lightly as possible so that they don't get fired? No, everybody wants to get as much as they can from their team, and they're going to lose that. But ultimately, in a lot of the places we're functioning, there are laws that protect what's going on. This is not just about people feeling good or doing or not doing their job, because I think throughout history we've been towing that line in many different ways. But there's been this kind of fear mongering around protected beliefs, specifically gender critical views, with several court cases being pointed at multiple times. But there is a document, it's called the Equality Act. There are legal professions that can help you interpret it, but ultimately, if you can read, you can probably figure it out. It's not rocket science what it says in there. But again, if you're an organization, you should have legal support and they'll tell you what it says. I think some of the cases that have gotten a lot of wind in media are not the right ones. You can look at the Kevin Linster case, for example, which is a really great illustration of gender critical views as views being protected, but discriminatory action incited by those views being condemned, and then the person was actually fired from their workplace. So it's very clear where things stand. We have laws that protect against discrimination. So you don't want to put yourself in a position where you get to that place, because even if there's just a dispute, the reputation of the workplace becomes under scrutiny, and ultimately for clients, for talent, you want to be attractive. So there's a lot to lose if you don't do. But I really, if that's the one thing that people kind of take away from this conversation, is that I don't think people should ever be scared about going forward and trying to do something, because it's better than not doing anything. And once you start developing inclusive workplaces, you also become better at apologizing and better at making mistakes. And that's a good thing. That's good for creativity. That's good for innovation. And we need to be okay with that, because ultimately everybody's going to make mistakes. I think, again, around the fear mongering around the Equality Act, the one thing that we don't seem to mention at all is there are court cases every day, all day long, across the world. That's why we have so many people who are lawyers and judges, because law is being interpreted. There's an organic number of disputes that will always happen, and you may be part of them. That's how we function in the world. That's a normal state of living in a system with rules told in human language, because everything is up for interpretation. So Fear ultimately is never a helpful place to start with. Again, neurologically, that's an emotion which entirely inhibits the cognitive function. So it's not a good place to be at. So courage for organizations, I say.
Absolutely. I definitely agree with that one. And what I'm really getting is that, you might survive, but you won't thrive. And actually, you're maximizing your risk by not doing anything, not only to kind of specifically LGBTQ plus risk, but also, I suppose, mental health and well-being, because that in itself is a huge risk to organizations, particularly in certain industries. There are higher levels of suicide rates and things because those industries don't have those supports for people who are suffering with mental health. So yeah, that I think that really resonates. And I just wondered if we could touch on what things organizations can be doing. What would you say are the first steps to building out an inclusion strategy for LGBTQ plus individuals in their organization?
I think an inclusion strategy has to be holistic and has to come from a holistic place. So we think about inclusion altogether, not specifically just for queer people. And again, I always look at things strategically. You need to start always at the top. In Bulgarian, we have an expression: the fish starts thinking from the head. Right? So the first step is to ensure that the top of the organization, the leadership, is well educated on the importance of what you're doing, the effects on the business. Thumbs up. No, that's one. How it's relevant to the business itself, to the business function as well, because it will be relevant. What are the facts? What are the things that you need to understand about the different communities that have been historically oppressed and discriminated against? So you need to start from an educated place at the top. Then when you look at the grassroots initiatives, you need to empower people to be able to speak up. One of the biggest challenges when you start developing diversity and inclusion initiatives is that complaints skyrocket. And people are not usually prepared for that. Again, as a consultant, that's one of my functions, is to educate the leaders first that this is a good thing. We're starting to create psychological safety, so people start coming out and speaking up about the things that are problematic for them, because you as a leader won't experience that, you won't feel it, because you have power. Power dynamics are fundamental to address. So you start at the top, you educate the leaders, then you make sure that people in the grassroots are empowered to be able to speak up, to point out the issues, whether that's going to be employee resource groups and other ways in which people feel like they can talk. I think it's fundamental to have multiple routes for logging out complaints, right? Because this is one of the most difficult things. If the only way for you to speak up is through a person who's currently discriminating against you or oppressing you, immediately means you can't do anything. That's not going to happen. So having different ways, sending out that message to people that this is what we do, this is what we accept. So start at the top, ensure the bottom works, and then you solidify all of that with proper policies that say the right thing and list out what our view is as an organization, what view are we taking stand on around everything that's relevant to our employees. It needs to be written down. It needs to be commitment. It can't just be performative. It can't just be, symbols are important. I'm not gonna be someone here saying that that's not important. I love seeing pride flags in different places. I love seeing rainbow lanyards. I think it really helps me feel that I'm in a safer place. It's an indicator, but we need to go into actual functional effectiveness for that inclusion. So whether that's going to be, first of all, ensuring all of your policies are addressing truly everyone, that you have relevant policies for all of the stages of life of your employee, not only within your organization, but within their lives, because they're full human beings and they exist in that space, around literally from cradle to the grave, because people have children, people are carers, And that is part of their everyday life. So how are we addressing all that? Having that written down is very important. And I think if you have this kind of strategic approach, it can feel daunting, and each one of those steps have a lot in them, but it needs to start as a big view, because just as I said before, a lot of people do things here and there because of a visibility day or because of Pride Month or because of this and that. And that's a start in a lot of ways. And then, again, I'm not going to say don't do that, but it's not nearly as effective. And sometimes it can make people feel tokenized. It can make, just not the right kind of change. So thinking strategically, I think, is the first step, and looking at it from all the angles.
That makes complete sense to me, and it's a sensible approach. I think I don't think anyone can deny that. In terms of line management, obviously we know that line management has such an impact on the individual and their kind of psychological safety within the workplace. Do you have any advice for line managers?
Yes, for sure. I think you're so right. They say what they say: people don't leave jobs; they leave managers. Right? So often, your jobs very rarely will dramatically change. You signed up for what you're doing, but these relationships, your everyday, will really affect that. And as a manager, the key thing here is a power dynamic, right? You're in position of power over the people that are reporting to you. I mentioned that before. This is their livelihood. We live in a capitalist world. However, we may feel about this or not, this is the current reality. And especially now, losing your job could be entirely destructive to a person. And if you're their manager, you hold a key to that stability in their life. So awareness of that is extremely important. And it's a skill, right? And this is one of those terrible statistics. This one I don't have receipts for, but I feel like I've heard somewhere something like 80% of managers, just like 80% of statistics that are made up, but a huge percent of people who are in managerial positions have never had any training in working with people. They've just been really good at their jobs, and that they've progressed and they ended up having people under them. And there's a huge difference between being good at doing something and actually managing people. So figuring out what their training is, how to get it, demanding that as part of their progression as well, is a fundamental step. That education, then having that practice and having a reflective practice as well on their work, just as any other aspect of their work, I think is very important. As you mentioned before, I'm a coach, and I think coach trainings could be extremely beneficial to understanding how to best support someone's growth, because you learn how to listen to people better and how to get them to utilize themselves in the best possible way. So that's a good start somewhere. Of course, you can't know everything, and I think this is the big complaint you always get. Oh, but I can't know everything. Yeah, but you should know some stuff. And I think again, we've around the fear mongering, there's been a lot of like trying to release responsibility of power. But when you have power, you have a responsibility to educate yourself, to understand how people who are not like you have been experiencing the world historically. It can be very interesting as well. I find that fascinating when it doesn't necessarily kind of fall under the umbrellas of my own identity. But it's important because then you can make a person feel seen. And once someone feels seen, you've won their trust and you can really work with them in the best possible way. So you do need to make an effort to educate yourself.
Great stuff. Thank you, Katya. And I also, just quickly before we finish, I wanted to touch on the UN's independent expert on protection against the violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. That is a mouthful. And that's upcoming research on intersex issues. Can you quickly kind of tell us what that is and why you think this is such groundbreaking work?
Yeah, it's been so amazing to have this resolution signed very recently. It was about a month ago at the start of April. In the UN, we had, I think, 20-something countries signed a resolution called Combating Discrimination, Violence, and Harmful Practices Against Intersex People. And this is groundbreaking because we haven't actually had a good piece of research on people with intersex variations, and they have been suffering. We have been suffering for a very long time, since the 50s. In recorded ways, we have seen a lot of non-consensual surgical interventions on infants, just to make them compliant to what people believe gendered bodies should look like. The one piece of research we have from quite a few years back, is that 1.7% of people across the world have intersex variations, and even that piece of research is not. I mean, it's just one study. Like, we need more evidence. And first of all, shall I actually, before I start saying that, shall I clarify what intersex variations mean?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's do it.
So when we talk about gender, we talk about an innate sense of who you are and an identity. There is a huge debate around, obviously, trans people and the immutability of sex as such, and the binary nature of sex, right? Oh, yes, but, quote unquote, they're just men and women. In terms of physical sex characteristics, scientifically, that is not the case. And there are a lot of people who are born with a natural variation in their sex characteristics. And we talk about sex characteristics, that means primary sex characteristics, which may include chromosomes, sexual organs, and then secondary characteristics, which are hormones, body shape, facial hair, body hair altogether, body shape in a lot of ways. So this is an entirely natural variation in human existence, and very few. There are an array of intersex variation. I think at the moment, intersex Equal Rights UK identifies 40 different intersex variations, and some of them are much more expressed. People have ambiguous genitalia. Some of it are much more subtle. Mine is a hormonal focused one, so it expresses itself as facial hair, even though I've been assigned female at birth. There's a huge variety of them, and historically, people have been really mistreated. As I said, young kids have undergone very severe, very damaging, and unnecessary surgical procedures to make them, quote unquote, normal, when they're entirely normal the entire time, because there's nothing more natural than variation in nature. So having this resolution sign means that a significant piece of research will be triggered. Hopefully it'll come out next year, and we'll be able to base any kind of movements towards equal rights and betterment of the existence of intersex people on something a bit more stable. And to me personally, I'm very passionate about this, because I think once we understand that sex isn't binary either, it becomes so much easier to accept non-binary people, to accept trans people. If sex isn't binary, then why would you even prescribe relationship between, quote unquote, the sexes? So queer people as a whole will benefit from that so much. But also in the trans agenda, it is so blatantly hypocritical that we are terrified about transitioning of children, when, first of all, we only talk about social transitioning of children. We are asking that when trans kids want to be addressed a certain way, they're called the name that they want and they use their pronouns. When at the same time, we are harming young kids who have intersex variations with no questions asked. Still, so often, medical professionals pressure parents to get their kids under the knife, just to, quote unquote, normalize them. And I think that there may be like one or two variations which actually require a surgical intervention for health reasons. The majority of them don't. They really, really don't. So why are we okay with this, and we can't call a kid what they want to be called? It just really kind of makes you stop and think about that. But it's been difficult. We've tried recently in the UK, and the census was the first time sexuality and gender identity was included. We tried to push for intersex variations, but unfortunately that wasn't successful. So we didn't have that evidence of our existence. And if we're not counted, we don't count. We can't require these public funds to then support our lives the same way. So yeah, I think it's very important it's so groundbreaking that finally there is this big body that's putting their foot down. And they've actually, for the last 10 years, there has been, from the World Health Organization, there have been a few studies and very clear statements around intersex variations in kind of in the benefit of people and their kind of freedom of choice of what they do with their bodies and how they're identified. So we know what the evidence are, but culture is so strong that we haven't really been able to move the needle the way we'd like it to. So this is just extremely encouraging, and I cannot wait for it to come out.
Yeah, it's as you say, I think at the very least it gives us more education, more awareness, and for those individuals also more acknowledgement of I suppose what it is that they live with on a daily basis. And I'm excited to see what the research kind of shares and educates us all on. So thank you for sharing that, Katya. And thank you so much again for your time today. It's been wonderful to chat to you. And I'm sure we could actually sit here and chat for another hour, but we're going over time now. So thank you so much. It's been incredibly educational and insightful.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.